Okay, our speaker is Norman Black, who is a Navy journalist over in the Pacific area. But this guy is just unique. He does interviews as well, and he's authored 9 volumes of interviews with combat veterans of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and currently working on volumes of interviews with combat veterans from Vietnam. And he's a very unique individual, does a lot of public affairs work, but he was telling me, or he mentioned to me, has written a number of stories on those people that were over there in Vietnam that were commercial, that had nothing to do, they worked with the military, but they were civilians. And a lot of them stayed over there. And he's got some great stories. And I thought, wow, this would be interesting because I'm sure most of you, like myself, I met a lot of the civilians that were working over there. And I was shocked. I had one friend that said, well, I'm staying. And we were trying to move everything out. And I just thought, wow, this might be interesting, and y'all may have some stories that you can tell him about. But I would like to introduce to you Norman Black, who is just an outstanding individual. Norman, come on in.
I could not have said better. Thank you. Thank you. My mother could not have said better. What I have to talk about has to do with missing in action from the Vietnam War. I became interested in MIAs. I have it right here. No? All right. I became interested in MIAs after I published volumes of interviews with combat veterans of the Vietnam War. One of them was Eugene McDaniel, a Navy pilot that was shot down over North Vietnam and was in prison for 6 years. During the time he was there, 2 Air Force officers attempted an unauthorized escape, unauthorized by their American unit commander, or prison building commander. The Vietnamese soon learned that he was communications link between the POW camps and tortured him for 9 days to try to learn the names of the person who was the communications link in the other building. He refused to tell them and almost died from the repeated beatings they gave him. After his repatriation, McDaniel was awarded a Silver Star for heroism and given command of the aircraft carrier USS Lexington in recognition of his heroism. In December of 1978, from command of Lexington, he was sent to Capitol Hill as the Navy Marine liaison officer to the House of Representatives. The man that was sent to the Senate at the same time was John McCain. McDaniel held that job until he retired in January 1982. He said that while he was there, he learned repeatedly that the U.S. had abandoned U.S. prisoners of war, not just civilians, but prisoners of war in southeastern Asia. When McDaniel was shot down, his navigator, who was James Kelly Patterson, ejected and landed on the other side of the hill from McDaniel. For 4 days, he was in communications with U.S. aircraft overhead that could not get down to rescue him. And then he disappeared. McDaniel has said repeatedly to me that he has reason to believe that Patterson is alive and was sent to the Soviet Union because of his technical knowledge. In 2016, McDaniel sent in a FOIA request for information about shoot-downs during the period when he was shot down, and received a copy of a Soviet newspaper printed on November 4th, 1991, say that a pilot was flown from Vietnam through China to Russia to Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan in September 1967, and then on to the Soviet Cosmonaut Center. It did not specify when he was flown onto the Cosmonaut Center, but it did say that the pilot was second pilot on an aircraft shot down on May 19th, 1967, which was the date on which McDaniel was shot down, and it was the only aircraft of that type with a navigator on it that was shot down on that date. McDaniel received an email from Patterson's younger brother, who had served in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, who had gone looking for his brother, to say that he found out that he went to Kazakhstan, made an appeal on Kazakh TV and radio, and showed his brother's picture, and as a result received information that from a woman there who phoned in and said she had seen the man. He went over. He came back to the U.S. and reported it to, I assume, to someone in the federal government. They sent somebody over there, and when they got there, the woman denied she had ever called in or said anything. So clearly, the forces that are and what was then the Soviet Union had gotten to her and told her not to say more. McDaniel said that when he was working in the House of Representatives, he became aware that not all U.S. prisoners held by the Vietnamese had been repatriated. And he began to speak out publicly about this. And when he did, he said the powers that were in existence at that time, the establishment, came at him with a vengeance. He was attacked with innuendo by people who worked for what he called the shadow government. Their behavior indicated to him that he was on the right trail and that there was a lot more to this than he was aware of. He said he was very lucky, and he was a serving officer at the time. He was very lucky that some senators and congressmen believed in him and stood up for him. In 1986, he said he received a phone call from Army Colonel Richard Childress of the National Security Council. Childress called McDaniel at 10:30 at night and told him not to say anything more about prisoners of war. When McDaniel asked him why, and if he thought there were American prisoners held yet in Vietnam, Childress said, "Yes, you're damn right there are." McDaniel said he asked when they would come home, and Childress said 2 or 3 years. McDaniel, as a result of that call and what was said to him, understood that Childress' call was an attempt to intimidate him. McDaniel said we did get a select committee created in the U.S. Senate in 1991. At that time, there were 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. It was chaired by John Kerry of Massachusetts. and Bob Smith. And Bob Smith of New Hampshire. McCain was one of the Republicans. The whole thing came to naught because McCain was very, very clear that there were no American prisoners held in Vietnam after the final release. After 18 months of meetings, the Senate Select Committee, its executive summary, concluded that we might have left a few, but only a handful. That upset McDaniel, who wanted to know what a handful was and why anybody was left there. And I have forgotten about this. There we are. That's McDaniel on the right and Kelly Patterson on the left. That's McDaniel when he was released from prison camp. You can see how gaunt he looks. I don't know what that Air Force officer, where they got him, but he looks as if he's on a TV program. And there is McDaniel reunited with his daughter. That was him when he was given, the day on which he was given command of Lexington. His retirement picture. And that's the man that stopped everything. A woman named Amy Waters Yarsinski worked in the U.S. Naval Intelligence for 33 years. She wrote a book entitled An American in the Basement, in which she said that the U.S. brought out 62 Vietnam MIAs in 1988, the last year of full year of Ronald Reagan's presidency. That was 15 years after McDaniel was repatriated. No. Okay, just quickly, that's the book that the interview, the autobiographical interview with McDaniel is in. That's where I wrote about MIAs for the first time, after which it began to work in my mind and aggravate me, and I became involved in this. That is American in the Basement, a good book to read if you want to be saddened by our U.S. government. Let's Kiss the Boys Goodbye. I'll get to that. McDaniel said he knew a lot about MIAs in addition to his work in the House, listening to documentation taken down there, because in 86 and 87, he worked in the Reagan White House on this specific issue. Yarsinski's book, he said, tells about Air Force General Thomas Lacey going to Hanoi in 1988 and bringing those 62 prisoners from Vietnam to a VA hospital in Oklahoma City. McDaniel said another worthwhile book is Kiss the Boys Goodbye, which was published in 1990. In it, the authors provide evidence that American troops were left in captivity in Indochina. The book tells about official obstruction, missing files, censored testimony, and pressures brought to bear on witnesses ready to tell the truth about missing U.S. personnel. That's another interesting book that is not going to brighten your day, but it deals well with this. Spite House is a book about a man named Bobby Garwood who served in the Marine Corps and was taken prisoner. He was court-martialed in 1981 for communicating with the enemy in an assault on an American POW while he was a prisoner. McDaniel said that Garwood did all that they said he did, but so did many, many others. He said what made Garwood different was that he had seen live prisoners in North Vietnam long after the war ended. So they destroyed his character so nobody would believe him. And that was done with help of the Marine Corps, courtesy of the U.S. government. McDaniel said, we do know that people were left in those countries, but I contend that the men were left prisoner in North Vietnam as well as in Laos and Cambodia. We do not know how many, but I would say it could be up to 1,000. This is almost 2 years ago. A small number of them could yet be alive. His navigator was 23 years old when shot down and could be alive in captivity today. In March 1997, through a Korean diplomat, the North Koreans offered a small number of prisoners from the Korean War to Clinton. Clinton turned it down because we had no peace treaty with North Korea. Shortly after that, McDaniel said one POW from the Korean War came back to North Carolina, which is where he was from. And the last he heard the mission in New York, we were offered a small number. I think it was 9 POWs, but we turned that down too. Shortly after this, from all the harassing that had happened to him, he decided that he had better back off because he did not fear for his life, but he thought from the wording of phone calls and other harassment that happened that his family could be in danger of physical harm. And if not that, of other kinds of harm where they worked and so forth. It only takes one visit from an FBI agent to your employer to sow a seed that will probably germinate into something harmful to a person. So he backed off after that, but he said, even in there was another incident after the USS Pueblo was captured when somebody he had served with on the Enterprise as a flyer, as a Navy pilot, got in touch with him and said that when they were off Korea during the Korean War, he had heard, that in 1968, he had intercepted communication that mentioned Kelly Patterson. That was within 21 days of the Pueblo incident. McDaniel said that after all these years, he thinks he understands the reason for MIAs. The CIA was carrying out a secret war in Laos and Cambodia for more than 13 years with no congressional funds appropriated. They were financing their war with drug activity in southeastern Asia. Congress didn't have a clue or didn't care and would not get involved with what was going on. After the Vietnam War ended, the CIA was supposed to look for prisoners. They were told by Congress specifically to do that. But he said they really were not looking for prisoners. They continued clandestine drug operations long after the war and used some income from it to support a rebellion in Nicaragua and other covert activities. And Congress did nothing. In January 1973, the U.S. and South Vietnam signed a treaty with North Vietnam, which ended U.S. military combat in Vietnam. And that was when, in June 73, Congress approved the Case-Church Amendment, which forbade U.S. military and activity in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam unless the president got specific approval for it. However, he said, U.S. military advisors continued to serve in South Vietnam with military units until April 75 when Saigon fell. McDaniel said clandestine U.S. operations in southeastern Asia continued a long time after the peace treaty. Amongst U.S. personnel killed and captured by Vietnamese units or Vietnamese allied units were, and this is in addition to the military POWs, this was civilian-clad military men and women directed by CIA and its agents, operatives, and employees. Some men sent on those missions had objected because they feared that those missions violated the U.S. treaty with North Vietnam, and if they were captured, they would be tried as war criminals. Some men that were captured by the communists after that date were first included in the list of POWs that the U.S. demanded from the Vietnamese return, but later their names were crossed off. According to McDaniel, no American captured during the secret war in Laos or Cambodia has been repatriated. He said they have, and they were talking now about flyers. And these are the commercial aircraft that went in to bring out drugs. And also combat aircraft. He said they had the same guns and aircraft bombing those countries that we had. And over Laos, we lost 500 aircraft. Over North Vietnam, 58% of those shot down survived shoot down. And logically, the same percentage would apply to flyers shot down over Laos and Cambodia. But none of them ever came out. In Kiss the Boys Goodbye, the authors report the following. Missing from the group of men who were returned by the North Vietnamese in early 1973 were more than 50 men known by the U.S. government to have been captured and held prisoner at one time or another. The U.S. government had a list of over 1,000 POWs not returned. And returning POWs identified other POWs that were not acknowledged or verified by the U.S. Those men were POWs with skills in electronic warfare and other specialties, and had been forced to work for North Vietnam, China, and the USSR. Despite solid U.S. intelligence that U.S. POWs were alive and continued to be held in Vietnam, U.S. officials found ways to negate that intelligence, even when military intelligence chiefs in charge of the subject stated categorically that they were convinced that those men were POWs and alive and imprisoned in Indochina. So we have the congressional level negating what the military say. Hundreds of refugees also reported seeing American POWs in all parts of communist Southeastern Asia in those early post-war years. Some had spent time in prison with Americans. Some testified under oath before congressional committees that they saw them. Defense Intelligence Agency analysts often accepted witnesses' testimony as true, except for the part about living POWs. U.S. government records confirm that as recently as 1982, at least 6 U.S. POWs were held in Laos, and we're getting down to nitty-gritty now. And a former CIA agent said in that year that he had seen living POWs that the U.S. government had declared dead. And in late 1988, Vietnamese leader Truong Chin told author William Stevenson that many U.S. POWs were alive and held in Vietnam. In 1989, Vietnam offered to return 150 POWs for $2 million each. But the offer collapsed when the U.S. backed the Khmer Rouge against the Cambodian government, which the Vietnamese supported. And nothing more was done. In late 1889, investigators for Senator Jesse Helms and Charles Grassley revealed a report that gave detailed information of 20 U.S. prisoners that were yet alive and imprisoned in Vietnam at that time. Stevenson wrote that it is possible that the U.S. initially denied the existence of POWs remaining in Indochina after the prisoner exchange of 1973, and did so for political expediency, then made judgmental errors about the continued importance of denying the existence of those men, and then developed the conviction that national security would be hurt by admitting that they had abandoned U.S. fighting men. It would be hard to recruit more men to do things like that. All information about POW sightings was eventually classified confidential. The reason probably had nothing to do with national security, but everything to do with protecting careers of people that had said 10 years earlier that there were no living POWs left in Indochina. It served politicians that wanted to end further discussion and investigation so urgently that they ignored the many POWs thought to be alive but not returned. They would not admit their errors or lies. Senior U.S. military officers that stated that there were yet U.S. POWs held in Indochina were humiliated or punished for speaking out. Some parts of the U.S. government had special reasons for not wanting the remaining POWs searched for and returned. I'm through. And that had to do with the sale of drugs. That's it. Sir?
You had at one point you were working with Karen Handel in the U.S. House.
Yes.
What's the progress of that?
She lost the election and had done nothing. I was able to, Miss Jenkins, who worked for her, returned petitions at my request. One other thing, this is a most recent book called to my attention, and the picture shows something in, I think it's in Laos, and underneath scratched out is a code that was supposed to be used by down flyers. That was about 10 years ago. that picture was taken. It could only have been men that were left behind that did that, at a very large scale. It was taken in 1982, I think it is. Yeah. So it was more than 10 years ago. Anyway, I circulated petitions to several veterans groups and then gave the signatures for the cover letter to Senator Perdue. That was in February. Bob Eckholm went with me to his office. He's a Marine that can read, and a very honorable and fine individual. Sir.
I need 1 sec. I don't know if anybody knows about it, but the people that were lost in Vietnam, not Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia, were not represented in the Paris Peace Accords. So they're basically
Non-people, non-existent.
they weren't represented.
Yeah, sir.
I just wanted to say there's actually 591 neo veterans returned. We keep forgetting that. Most people think there's 9 or 10 or a smaller number, but it's actually factually 591 released by March of '73 as part of the Paris Peace Accords. So that's a fact. That's probably the only positive thing that we have.
Thank you.
I think I've always thought I read part of Kiss the Boys Goodbye and had to stop. But I find it interesting that the consistent phrasing that the government uses is that there are no American prisoners left in North Vietnam. Doesn't say anything about Cambodia, doesn't say anything about Laos, doesn't say anything about any of the other countries in Southeast Asia that were held by communists. But there are no American prisoners left in North Vietnam.
Right.
And that's what the government says every time they get asked.
A very specific way of telling the truth while lying.
Exactly.
No, not really. Anybody that's been to Laos knows that it's entirely possible that there were people shot down, lost, missing possibly, and we never knew about them. We never knew whether they were dead or alive. It's an extremely rugged country, much more rugged even than the highlands in Vietnam. What I heard, and I want to make sure that I understood you correctly, was that multiple administrations, most of the United States Congress, most of the senior military leadership have all been lying except for this handful of people that wrote these books.
No, that's not quite right. The people that I'm referring to were not, in most instances, were not even reported missing. They did not exist. And ones that were shot down, in many instances, they're not listed. The one.
Didn't show up for the debriefing.
Pardon?
They didn't come back. They didn't show up for the debriefing. What? They didn't show up for the debriefing, he said. Flights that were shot down, the pilots and the crews just didn't show up for the debriefing. Air America was working out of VN-10, and they worked a little bit of nondescript rescue type things, not actually acknowledged by the government, but funded through nefarious ways. And I know two C-130 gunships that were shot down in March within 2 days of each other of 1972. And one of them, they rescued the people and got them out of there because the basic gunship had 14 people on it. So it was a little bit of an effort for a SAR to get that many people. They almost decided to just drop ammo and let them fight their ways out. But the other one exploded, and it was actually on fire when it hit the ground, but there could have been survivors to that. They had a lot of forward air controllers. They had a lot of guys that were academy graduates was working as facs and Raven facs on the ground, embedded in the indigenous people down there that there's no accounting for them.
Thank you. Okay.
One more question? Just happened to have brought something here with me. because I thought it might be interesting, but I didn't realize how interesting it might be. I just went to our reunion. I was with Air America all of '67, most of '68. We did a lot of those SCRs. We did almost all of them before the Jolly Green show. The 17 million, I think it was, I can't remember the exact number.
Thank you.
Almost everything's been declassified. There's absolutely no reference in there to most of what he said. I do happen to think that there were Americans that were lost in Laos and maybe held by some of the mountain people that weren't on our side, and we never knew it. And maybe even the North Vietnamese never knew it. But the idea that it's another one of these dark web, deep state, it's nonsense, in my opinion.
In February, early February, we presented Purdue with petitions to ask that all information pertaining to CIA, congressionally ordered CIA searches for MIAs be declassified. And we've heard nothing back. Repeated attempts to get an answer to that have failed. Thank you.
He does have some petitions, if you're interested in signing them, to try to get the support that he's looking for, that we need really to get the government to release or to declassify these documentation, which certainly would give proof to all these things. Well, don't leave yet, please. Yes, sir.
You got any information about the CIA's Phoenix program? I've been working with a neighbor, his brother was in it, and he's trying to get benefits for his family overseas, but the records have been erased.
Can't hear what you're saying.
Deny that my neighbor's brother was ever overseas. His records have been erased.
Go over with this.
The Phoenix program.
No, it's all right. It's,
They won't even fit into the service.
I have no information about that, but there is a man living in Madison, Georgia, that was involved with the Phoenix program, and I can give you his name, and you'd have to find a way to reach him.
I want to give, in appreciation of your speaking, this says, with our appreciation, Atlanta Vietnam Veteran Business Association, proud, professional, patriotic. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you.